Before we say anything, we must make it unambiguously clear that we do not, nor would we ever, encourage or condone harassment towards any individuals present in this video. We also must mention that any and all copyrighted material in this video is used in a way that is transformative and intended for the purposes of reporting, comment, and criticism, and is therefore protected under fair use. This video is an edited version of a prior upload removed by YouTube. To be clear, this removal was definitely not the result of someone flagrantly abusing YouTube's notoriously exploitable copyright claim system to falsely and illegally impose a DMCA takedown on that video. To reiterate, that aforementioned scenario definitely did not happen. After all, in order for something like that to occur, we would have to be dealing with someone so petty, insecure, and narcissistic that they would be willing to risk losing their channel and literally breaking the law just to censor mild criticism based upon readily available public information. Thankfully, what I just described is a completely hypothetical person who does not exist in the real world. In stark contrast, we worked with an individual who was so diplomatic and civil that they allowed us to re-upload an edited version of the original video. How gracious of them. With all that said and done, it's time to talk about Solar Crown. Alright, let's get everyone up to speed. Test Drive Unlimited was, put succinctly, revolutionary. Released in 2006, the first game in the franchise allowed players to drive online across a large-scale recreation of a real-world location for the first time, laying the foundation for series like The Crew and Forza Horizon, and continuing to influence those series to this day. However, while many features from the 2006 game have been adopted by its spiritual successors, many of the most beloved and immersive aspects of the open-world racer were ignored by the games that followed in its footsteps. And with the critical and commercial failure of its 2011 follow-up, it seemed like the series as a whole, and the innovations that came with it, would both be relegated to video game history. All that changed in 2016. A decade after the release of the first game in the franchise, publisher Big Ben acquired the rights to Test Drive Unlimited, reinstilling hope among hardline fans that the series would retake its rightful place among the best open-world racers. In 2020, the now rebranded Nacon would present a CGI trailer for the first Test Drive Unlimited game in almost a decade, subtitled Solar Crown. Though the reveal lacked any substantive information beyond the existence of a new TDU game, longtime fans of the franchise were confident that they wouldn't have to wait long for actual gameplay and a tentative release date. Almost a year later, Nacon would release another CGI trailer that was similarly sparse with information, and though some felt disappointed with the continued absence of actual data, the promise of a massive reveal in July inspired the eager anticipation of many others. While this reveal did finally provide actual information regarding the game, including the presence of factions and the setting for the open world, it still failed to provide actual gameplay to an increasingly concerned core demographic. Worse still, the information absent from this CGI reveal was all the more concerning given one of the few pieces of critical information provided by the preview, the release date. Slated for September 2022, the new TDU, beginning development just prior to the first teaser trailer and having yet to show any gameplay or even in-engine footage at this point, was set to be completed by a small team with no prior experience creating large-scale open worlds and successfully ported to half a dozen different consoles in just over a year. This was, to put it diplomatically, an unrealistic timeline. A fact that fans of the franchise processed in wildly different ways. While some intended to elicit a critical backlash against the publisher and push for change, Others projected their anxieties onto their peers, either through patronizing response videos or thinly veiled vitriol within internet echo chambers, while still others decided to be weirdly horny. After roughly another year of almost complete radio silence, Nacon announced, to the relief of many including ourselves, that Solar Crown would be delayed and that last-gen console versions would be cancelled in order to maximize the overall quality of the game. While many were moderately assuaged, many more remained frustrated that they would have to wait another year for the game, a frustration that would be further aggravated by yet another teaser trailer a few months later. Though the trailer did technically include in-engine footage, the few seconds present in that trailer were both largely static and heavily obscured by motion graphics. Premiering in tandem, the first official in-engine screenshots from the game, featuring empty environments completely devoid of cars, also failed to revitalize the fanbase. At this point, even the cult-like toxic positivity of the game's online echo chambers began to erode, as participants became increasingly aware that there was still nothing substantiating Solar Crown's hype. After another half-year of deafening silence and increasing resentment, Nacon finally released in-engine screenshots that included actual car models as part of an open letter to the community, providing some long-overdue information about what many players now saw as a completely hypothetical game. While the information and images provided by the letter and its follow-ups would be acceptable engagement for a small Kickstarter project, it was far from sufficient for a game meant to compete with AAA juggernauts that had already squandered years of goodwill, especially given the far more extensive reveal of a direct competitor just 1 month earlier. Nacon needed something to salvage the public perception of Solar Crown, and thankfully, with the game at long last in a somewhat presentable state, they could finally quash the biggest question hanging over the head of the next Test Drive Unlimited.
So now we know how we got here. Let's take a look at what we got.
So, after all that anxiety and anticipation, how was the long-awaited Solar Crown gameplay reveal? Well, a bit underwhelming. The gameplay reveal amounted to little more than a handful of game developers and racing game influencers awkwardly socializing with and crashing into each other with very little actual information. Okay, that's a bit reductive. In reality, the gameplay demo revealed quite a lot of details about the new TDU, though much of it was obscured by the chaos of crashes and awkward attempts at conversation.
Alan, as long as I beat you, I'm just gonna have to assume that Tenerife should be like a DLC or something. Oof.
Aside from demonstrating that Solar Crown actually exists, the demo made it clear that this new TDU game is, to a certain degree, a true TDU game. Unlike other racers that rigidly fix the first-person camera to a 180-degree horizontal axis, Solar Crown allows players to move the camera around the cabin and even to look back through the actual rear window of their vehicle. While the likes of Forza Horizon automate headlight functionality based upon time of day and weather conditions, in Solar Crown, it's the player's prerogative. Beyond just headlights, players are afforded the ability to toggle turn signals, wind up windows, and raise the roof on their cars, all features present in prior games in the series and, as such, essential to include in a sequel. Better still, more obscure aspects of prior games have also carried over into Solar Crown. Skill chains with in-game payouts return from TDU 2 alongside discoverable wrecks. Though it's worth noting that second feature was merely implied by the user interface and may not appear in the launch version of the game, for reasons we will discuss later. Beyond basic similarities to prior entries in the series, Solar Crown also includes features from outside the franchise, including emotes, functional gas stations, and Horizon-adjacent speed zones, but despite this, much of the public perception is that the demo was a disappointment, a perception that we can credit to Nacon's piss-poor public relations. Much like the CGI trailers and radio silence that preceded it, the gameplay reveal failed to directly address the core concerns of the fanbase. Instead of focusing on features, it prioritized the people playing the demo. Worse still, the scattershot approach often highlighted unfinished aspects of the game, something that wouldn't be so egregious if Nacon was more direct regarding the incomplete state of Solar Crown. Put succinctly, the reveal finally answered the fanbase's most pressing question, but ultimately failed to deliver much beyond that initial answer, suffering from many of the same issues that plagued the first 3 years of public perception. By highlighting crashes and incomplete environments over finished features, Nacon essentially threw the hard work of developer KT Racing under the bus, confident in the knowledge that prolific content creators like Alex7 would do unpaid PR and damage control for them. Unfortunately, as frustrating as Nacon's inability to properly market the game may be, a clumsy reveal is far from the game's biggest flaw, and while public perception may inhibit its success, there are some foundational problems that threaten the very future of Solar Crown. Though several features from prior entries in the series were present at the gameplay reveal, one of the most crucial components of a TDU game was conspicuously absent: player houses. Though many players already knew that houses would be missing months prior to the gameplay reveal, their absence remains a devastating blow to fans of the franchise. Unlike so many other games where the home space is little more than a main menu, Test Drive Unlimited transformed this subconscious interface into an active gameplay mechanic. Before the player could even access a home space, they would drive to and tour very literal property listings, comparing prices, viewing varied exteriors, looking through a diverse range of modeled interiors, and accounting for available garage space before driving to the local real estate office to purchase the property. Once bought, the player character occupied actual space within their house, changed clothes within a literal walk-in closet, and could organize their car collection in a garage space unique to that estate. The sequel made this mechanic even more immersive and involving, allowing players to both walk around their homes in first person and to individualize their space with different wallpaper and upholstery. Put simply, houses were a fantastic mechanic combining pragmatism with personalization in a way that was emblematic of the entire Test Drive Unlimited experience, and their absence represents a devastating blow to dedicated fans. Nacon insists that houses will return to Solar Crown sometime after launch, but that assertion highlights other issues with the new entry, the first of which being the uncomfortable likelihood of microtransactions. From purchasable currencies to loot boxes, microtransactions have plagued the video game industry for over a decade, failing to provide any actual enhancements and almost always encumbering the gameplay experience. It's a decision exclusively made for the benefit of publishers and shareholders at the literal expense of the players, one that all too often targets a small handful of vulnerable people. Disgusting as this decision is in any game, the inclusion of in-game payments for items is particularly revolting in a game like Solar Crown, where in-game items are direct surrogates for real-world status symbols. The very real possibility that the in-game economy in this new TDU will deliberately push players into paying real money for a virtual house is at best extremely exploitative. The fact that this game will feature playable casinos exacerbates this already abhorrent situation, seemingly pulling away the metaphorical mask to reveal a game explicitly designed to exploit people with gambling addictions. Sadly, even if Nacon makes the right decision and eliminates in-game purchases from Solar Crown, the game will still ultimately be doomed to die. A few months prior to the gameplay reveal, Nacon all but outright confirmed to a French financial news outlet, and tellingly not the fanbase, that Solar Crown would launch as a live service. This not only suggests that players will pay full price for an unfinished game that will remain incomplete long after launch day, but also almost guarantees that the game will launch with always online DRM. For longtime viewers, you are likely well aware of how detrimental this decision will be for Solar Crown, and for everyone else, here's the gist of it. DRM, or Digital Rights Management, is software packaged into games that, while meant to prevent piracy, is more often than not a nuisance for paying customers. Always online DRM, the most draconian form of this software, forces the game to maintain a constant internet connection with an online server, one that will eventually and inevitably be shut down, in order to be playable, initially making the game unplayable in rural or impoverished areas, and ultimately making the game unplayable for everyone. In recent years, this practice has become increasingly common among games in the AAA space, particularly racing games. Both mainline entries of TDU's spiritual successor, The Crew, have always online DRM. We have made several videos discussing how always online DRM has been detrimental to Gran Turismo 7, and one of our biggest complaints leveled against Forza Horizon 5 in our in-depth review of the game directly involved that game's artificially imposed online requirements. With the devastating news that even the soft reboot of Forza Motorsport will be at the mercy of the player's internet connection, the fact that Test Drive Unlimited Solar Crown will in all likelihood represent the final nail in the coffin for racing game ownership makes my heart sink. It is tragically ironic how a franchise that blazed the trail for online open-world racing would be held hostage by the very thing that made it so uniquely liberating. A tragedy that's all the more frustrating given that we saw all of this coming years in advance. Perhaps most frustrating of all is not only that we were among the few people who saw the writing on the wall, but that many of those who did not went out of their way to discredit our dissenting opinions and push for a forced positivity regardless of the warning signs. To be frank, it would have been nice if people in more advantageous positions used their influence to affect change instead of constantly downplaying valid criticism in favor of willfully myopic optimism and The final section of this video was originally intended as an open letter to a specific individual. But considering that said individual respectfully disagreed with us regarding the definition of fair use, it's safe to assume that such a person would not be receptive to our request to hold nacon accountable regarding the aforementioned issues with Solar Crown. To digress with my personal opinion on an unrelated but depressingly common scenario for a moment, it's incredibly frustrating how some people are so unable to accept any form of direct criticism that they will exploit YouTube's indifference to on-platform abuse in order to silence it. Especially when said criticism is well substantiated and the subject of said criticism has some kind of relationship that compromises their ability to be entirely honest with their audience. With all that said, I am instead asking you, our audience, to take the lead and express your opinions to nacon and KT Racing directly. At the risk of reiterating, we do not encourage or condone any form of harassment against any individual or organization, and with that in mind, we request that any messages sent to nacon or KT Racing are both respectful and civil in nature. Aside from the fact that it is morally wrong to be needlessly rude or to threaten someone, doing so would also be antithetical to our goal of saving Solar Crown. Do not use any foul language, and if you are to be critical, make sure to focus your attention on ideas, gameplay mechanics, and software applications, not on specific people. Nobody deserves to suffer needlessly on the front lines against a dog pile of misplaced vitriol and contempt, least of all a representative who is in all likelihood underpaid by the publisher or developer. On the subject of being underpaid and overworked, we would request that along with voicing your concerns and distaste for microtransactions, DRM, and other live service garbage, anyone who sends a message to these companies also uses this opportunity to advocate for the KT Racing developers that are currently on strike for better working conditions. Regardless of how you feel about the current state of Solar Crown, these people are neither responsible for the anti-customer practices pushed by their publisher, nor do they deserve to needlessly suffer under the thumb of said publisher just so the game can make an unrealistic deadline. They are human beings that deserve both fair treatment and fair pay for their thankless and indispensable work, and there is nobody better to advocate for their advancement than the people who enjoy the fruits of their labor. After all, Do we really want the next Test Drive Unlimited to be an incomplete, always online Skinner box full of microtransactions that exploits its players and whose very existence is the product of exploited workers? They deserve better than that. And so do we. Thank you for joining us on the classiest cavern on the World Wide Web.